Welcome to the Rocks Back Pages podcast. My name is Barney Hoskins. I'm here with my Rocks Back Pages colleagues, Mark Pringle.
Hi, Barney.
And Jasper Morrison-Bowie.
Hello, Barney.
Well, that was a very sombre hello. They're getting more and more sombre.
I know.
He just doesn't want to become a cliche of himself. That's his real fear.
It's ennui and existential angst, I think, that's creeping.
Oh, well, that's okay then. No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. As I say, welcome to the RBP podcast. We are today going to be talking a little later about Orange Juice and Edwyn Collins and Postcard records. We're going to be talking about Danny Goldberg, former manager of Nirvana, who at one time was a rock critic and has just published a book about Kurt Cobain called Serving the Servant. But first, we're going to be talking about Todd Rundgren, who's just been playing in London. This week's audio interview is...
It is, indeed. It's Bill DeMain in December 97 on the phone to Todd. We'll play a clip straight away. This is Todd talking about this new thing called the internet.
This new idea of delivering online enables me to go back to a time when people wrote and recorded songs more or less all the time, rather than in specific chunks or time periods that related to the marketing of music. Mm-hmm. In other words, once the LP and then the CD became the standard form factor, musicians spent less time creating new music and more time promoting old music, because your product cycles are 2 or 3 years apart, and if you've had any success, you're heavily invested in that. You spend 3-6 months, sometimes longer, writing and recording an album that you'll then spend the next 2 years performing and promoting. And so your periods of musical creativity become spaced further and further out. In some ways, success works against you, in that people like what you're doing, so they want to hear you do it to death. Yeah. They're less interested in new stuff. They're interested in stuff you've done already.
Todd, as we all know, was very, very up on all technologies, a very early adopter of video and things like that. And this is 97, so it's pretty early days for the internet. He already saw that it was going to have a huge impact. Of course, he doesn't know how it's going to work out. But after that clip, he talks about the 2-year cycle of making an album, where you'd spend, let's say, 3 or 4 months recording an album, and then you tour it to death. And he said that he found that problematical as an artist, and he said he thinks a lot of bands found it difficult. He also then says how CDs have made it even worse, because suddenly people expect at least 60 minutes of music on a CD.
Yeah.
And so as a songwriter, you have to produce so much more work. And he sees this possibility that by working online is you can basically do songs as individual events and put them out.
And he was totally right, because you can also circumvent the whole publicisation cycle that goes with releasing an album. And we're seeing more and more people just making a splash by releasing it straight away. You don't have to do all the build-up publicity.
Absolutely.
And all of that sort of thing. He's really up on it at that stage, which is pretty remarkable for 1997.
In 97, there was no social media as such, but he almost sort of anticipates it in the way he describes that music can be recorded and released. So, it's very interesting. I mean, you're a big Todd fan, aren't you, Barney?
He's my main man, or he's one of my main men. He really is. As it happens, I interviewed him in that year as well, and I went to San Francisco where he was living at that point, and he was really embedded in the Silicon Valley as it was.
Didn't he also invent the first graphics tablet?
I think you may be right. I mean, I
was just reading his Wikipedia page when he came on air. So, but I thought that was funny. That's in 1980, so he's very much.
I think in many ways one of the great sort of pitfalls. He's always been ahead of the curve, and he's never really been able to take advantage of the curve. He's such a pioneer in so many ways. I mean, and I can remember when I visited him in San Francisco, he had everything on a laptop, and he did a couple of shows and all of the kind of backing tracks were on this laptop that just sort of sat on top of an amplifier, and of course inevitably it malfunctioned. And talk about being too far ahead of the curve. You know, he was experimenting with kind of synths and electronica way before most people. So you go back to the early 70s. And he's doing this kind of really interesting kind of hybrid of American singer-songwriter melodicism, but with a lot of electronic stuff going on around it.
I mean, we forget that, you know, we always regard him as an artist, but he was as much an engineer and a producer as an artist. And so the technology of making records was something that always interested him. I mean, he was very involved in building the Bearsville studio and things like that. One thing about this interview is, I mean, it was the interview. Bill DeMain writes for The American Songwriter, and the title gives it away. It's basically essentially meant to be about Todd as a songwriter. And he talks about the whole process. We'll have a clip later when he talks about plagiarism and originality. How he says most writers, they go from writing the personal stuff. Once they've run out of that, they start writing about generalizations. So he does talk about the process of writing songs and what he regards as a songwriter's job. I mean, it's curious because 97, his career had sort of...
Well, I mean, he'd been out in the commercial wilderness for quite a few years, really, at that point. And I think the album that came out that year was called With a Twist, and it was a kind of, you know, bossa nova revisiting of some of his greatest songs.
He is in fact, the interviews hung around that, and Bill keeps asking him,
about specific songs.
Do you remember writing that song? And he says, well, not really.
No.
The thing I was charmed by at the end is how he talks about how big an influence Yes were on Utopia.
Yeah, I can remember. I did a very big, I mean, what came out of that interview in 1997, the one I did, was the longest piece that Mojo ever ran. It was about 12,500 words. And I interviewed sort of everyone. And I remember B.B. Buell, who was his great consort, his girlfriend through the 70s.
And then briefly Elvis Costello's consort.
Yeah. I remember her saying, it was stuck in my mind that they'd wake up in their Greenwich Village house every morning and Todd would put on fucking Roundabout by Yes again. Not Roundabout again, Todd. So he was really influenced by Yes, and you can kind of hear that in the slightly later albums.
Yeah, I was fond of Todd. Hated Utopia.
Utopia was his prog band, really.
Yeah,
was a prog rock group.
Yeah.
I'd say listening to this audio was fascinating for me because, I mean, I really am a sort of dyed-in-the-wool Todd is goddess, and he has probably written 30 of my, favourite 200 songs. And so to hear him talk about songwriting, I found really interesting. I mean, he's extraordinarily articulate and bright guy. Probably one of the 5 most intelligent, you know, rock musicians I've ever met.
I mean, it is interesting that when you read interviews with people who've worked with Todd, that he could be a real struggle to work with. He was he's very dogmatic about processes and ways of doing things. You know, he wasn't a sort of laid back, let's kind of set up some amps and sting up some microphones sort of guy. He was really fanatical about the process. And you know, whilst some really enjoyed the experience, there are others who are less than sort of thrilled about it.
He was never really that interested in other people's music. I mean, the number of people I spoke to who'd be like, you know, pouring their heart and soul into this song, and they'd look up, and Todd would have his feet up on
the mixing desk,
reading a magazine. About studio engineering or something. And they'd go, well, was that all right, Todd? And he'd sort of go, yeah, fine, next. He really was just taking the money.
Well, but I didn't know until probably about half an hour ago that he produced Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell.
Yeah.
Well, that was his biggest commercial success.
But by produced, you'd say with inverted commas, because actually Jim Steinman really produced it.
Well, he wrote and arranged it, but Todd was the producer on it, but working with Steinman.
With Steinman there. Yeah. I mean, you know, Todd's role as a producer had been very restricted.
But this is one of the more bizarre stories. I mean, I don't think anyone thought that this was going to amount to anything. They couldn't even get a deal for that album. I mean, how the hell is this very overweight guy singing Todd Springsteen melodramatic rock songs? How is this going to parlay into
Well, and then
multi-million sales.
And then the sad story about how that fat guy got absolutely nothing from it. That Steinman had it so stitched up.
I had no idea.
Yeah, Mr. Loaf barely saw
appropriately named Loaf.
Barely saw any royalties.
That's sad. I had no idea.
All. No, it's a famous bone of contention. Meatloaf should have been a rich man on the back of that, and he never was.
But, of course, there are people who say that Todd should have been a rich man. I mean, I remember B.B. Buell saying, Todd just misses out on everything. Everyone steals from him. Prince stole from him.
True.
Prince was a huge fan, etc. And they long split up at this point.
Sure.
But she was bemoaning the fact that he just didn't kind of reap what he sowed and deserved to. And I saw him play in London last Saturday, and it kind of reminded me really of why Todd isn't sort of held up in the same estimation as, I don't know, anyone you could mention. I think he could have been one of the great stars, but he never took any counsel from anyone. He needed, after he parted ways with Albert Grossman, who, was Dylan's manager and Janis Joplin's manager. Albert, I think, did the best job he could for him, but Todd just never really listened to any advice. And I found myself watching him at Hammersmith on Saturday night, just thinking, Todd, there's so many things wrong with this show, with what you're wearing, with what you're doing, and I was loving the songs that he was singing, but I was also cringing, and I
needed an editorial voice. Maybe
I just want to take him aside and say, Todd, this is really, I think this is what you should be doing, and he just doesn't care enough.
Was he still playing the Gibson SG, the painted Gibson SG that Eric Clapton
the Fool,
gave him?
that was painted by the Fool.
Yeah.
No, I'm not sure that he still has that. Knowing Todd, he's probably had to sell that because he's just kind of hopeless with money. I mean, you mentioned the graphics tablet. He was a real pioneer of music videos. So when he made all that money out of Bad Out of Hell, he ploughed it into this video studio in Bearsville near Woodstock and just sort of squandered hundreds of thousands of dollars doing these what look like very kind of primitive little community. I mean, I think one of his videos was like the first or second to be played on MTV when it launched.
Yeah.
But I think in the long term, people will reevaluate Todd as one of the more original and brilliant figures in the 70s.
I mean, I first became aware of him, before I became aware of him as a kid, the Naz's singles were decent sized.
Great.
They were played on English pop radio, and I thought they were fantastic.
It opened my eyes, it's fantastic.
I thought the Naz were a really decent.
There was a classic moment on Saturday when I think the second song they played was Open My Eyes. It was a sort of journey through his kind of back catalogue, and his guitar strap immediately broke. and it just sort of, and it took about literally 2 minutes for some guys to run on and take the guitar. For another 3 minutes for him to fix this guitar strap. And you could just see Todd kind of losing his patience. And he sort of said, that's the first time I've ever had to play air guitar on Open My Eyes. And he said, well, maybe you should employ some slightly more together people. Anyway, so the great Todd Rundgren.
Yeah.
We'll hear another clip later.
Yep.
To turn our attention briefly to what is free on the homepage for the coming 7 days. The feature is all about Orange Juice and Postcard Records. Edwyn Collins has a new album out. Edwyn was the frontman, the main man in Orange Juice. I don't know whether, Mark, you ever had any strong feelings about Orange Juice?
I mean, I like them enough. I really like Rip It Up as a single. Their first real hit. He's a baritone singer. I don't generally love baritone singers. It is a slight sort of,
and a very mannered,
very mannered singer. But I mean, I like them. But I think in a way they were pointing in a direction of a certain sort of English pop, which actually proved to be fairly ghastly. I mean, when I think of bands like Haircut 100, they are sort of like Orange Juice light,
Yes.
And all with their guitars high up on their
chests. The sort of twee school.
The twee school. And there's an element of that. Postcard Records as a label, I think, is pretty interesting. There was it was one of two labels in Scotland at that time, and it was a time of great regionalism in English music.
Yes.
The match to scene. There was a lot of stuff happening in Liverpool with Echo and the Bunnymen and so on and so forth. And this was very much the Glasgow/Edinburgh scene.
Yeah.
I thought that was really good for English music. I think regionalism is good for music across the board, whether it's in America or whatever.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with the internet is it's sort of eroded regionalism.
Well, you get a different kind of factionalism in its place,
sure.
right? Like you get pockets of communities that are digital regions, if you will.
Okay.
I don't think,
Okay,
but I do take your point.
Yeah.
I think as far as pop music goes,
Yeah.
it's sort of gone a bit. But as far as the rest of the niches that you can niches that you can explore, niches that you can explore.
They were on Postcard.
The niches, yeah. They had the guitars up by the chins. I think that what regionalism gave music, whether it's Southern Soul, Memphis, Muscle Shoals, and so on and so forth, was distinct sounds based around usually a handful of recording studios, a handful of record labels.
That is a very good point.
And that is pretty much, I'd say is gone.
Partly because there are fewer recording studios as well, and everyone's doing everything in their bedrooms.
I mean, in hip-hop, there was the sort of the Atlanta sound, which, happened. There is a sort of New Orleans sound and so on. These things, like Postcard, are about communities of people.
Communities, I think, is a big one, and gigs as well, and venues as well as that.
Yeah. What did you think of?
It's a time I remember very fondly, fun enough, but because I was just starting to write in the music press, I really associate that time with all these indie labels and these scenes, and there was something actually rather endearing and charming and magical about it, and every week on the NME, the single of the week would be, some twee band from Glasgow or wherever. And actually, there were a lot of really classic little singles put out in that time.
You've got a very short period of time. Let's say if the Buzzcocks did Spiral Scratch in 76.
Kind of where it started,
which is
really.
the kind of first DIY indie single. So within 5 years, the music industry has been sort of broken wide open. Whether it's in London with Rough Trade, whether it's Postcard, whether it's Factory, and so on and so forth. And that sort of spirited independence, getting away from the majors, was critical. And there is a point shortly towards the end of Orange Juice's career when it's all starting to fall to pieces, is that the majors are starting to buy up the indies and turn them basically into A&R departments for themselves. And actually the spirit which made all of this possible is seeping away, and the very notion of indie, the term becomes corrupted. It's no longer indie labels, it becomes a style of music, which is what we have today.
Exactly. Well, I mean, so the first of the three pieces for the feature is actually a great little piece from September 1980. Paul Morley, who was the real champion of a lot of this stuff, interviewing not only Edwin, but Alan Horn, the boss of Postcard, the founder of Postcard Records. They come down to London trying to get a deal. They're sort of harassing John Peel, trying to get him to play the first Postcard single, and not getting a lot of joy out of Peely. So it's a lovely little snapshot of these two chances.
I had a quick look at the piece, and they're very sort of fervent in their aspirations to make it big with this indie label.
Well, I mean, Edwin sort of says something like, I'm kind of tired of this antagonism between the indie sensibility and commercial pop. And in a way that presages everything that happens. I mean, they're moving out of this kind of skinny Velvet Underground sound of a lot of indie bands at that time. The Velvets were the sort of the benchmark. Everybody kind of wanted to be a version of the Velvet Underground.
Though which Velvets varied. Some wanted to be the Sister Ray Velvets, and some wanted to be the third album, the Pretty Songs Velvets. And I'd say Orange Juice very much in the third album, Pretty Songs sort of bracket.
And also a lot of humour Orange Juice had. I mean, charm and humour. Well, last week we were talking about Joy Division, obviously, and this they're sort of like the opposite of Joy Division. There's an archness, there's a humour, there's a charm there. But probably at the end of the day, slightly insubstantial. I love Blue Boy. I'm fond of Simply Thrilled Honey. They have a great charm as singles.
I don't know that. Of course, Edwin had this catastrophic medical crisis.
He had a stroke, he had a massive stroke.
And about 5 years ago?
Oh, probably longer now than that. It was about 10 years ago.
And he's had a very slow and very tricky recovery, but he's just made a new record, and the act of actually playing music, he had to sort of reinvent for himself, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but
he's had a lot of help from his wife, Grace, who's been just kind of massively important in his life. They've now moved all the way to almost the sort of the end of Scotland. I mean, they're about as far north as you can go. I just think he's a delightful guy, actually, and in that interview with Morley, and also the interview that we feature with Len Brown around Edwin's first solo album after Orange Juice broke up, so that's 1989, he's just really an interesting and amusing man with real great reference points.
We talked a little while back about another Paul Morley interview, but much later, just before the band, in fact just when the band was about to break up.
He's kind of miserable because the band is breaking up, and he's replaced the lineup several times.
Three times,
And that was the first time I'd heard of Orange Juice, and I went and listened to them and watched one of their music videos, and what actually struck me most of all was that they looked like they could have been a band that are around now, one of those hopeless pop revival, sort of 80s revival pop bands like the 1975 kind of thing. It was funny because they really, the hairstyles, the look, everything, it could have been a music video from yesterday. And that,
though even at that time it was reactionary. Like, you know, there was an element of Teddy Boy in some of the sort of the stuff, you know. But anyway, no, I think we like Edwyn Collins whether or not we are passionate about his music.
I think that's right. He is a thoroughly decent human being. I mean, funny enough, the Postcard band I liked most of all was Joseph Kay. I thought had a kind of emotion and an edge
a
little bit darker. One forgets that the Go-Betweens were originally on Postcard as well.
They? I didn't know.
Before really any of us had heard of them. One never knew. But Postcard really, I mean, it could have been a kind of great label. I think Alan Horn was one of those sort of sub-Malcolm McLaren types, you know, Alan McGee types. Of course, Alan McGee, the other Scotsman who really did, who started a Lindy label that became a huge thing, creation. So Postcard, I suppose, could have been creation if Alan Horn had been a little more savvy. The last piece is Pete Perfides' review of a great book that Simon Goddard wrote about Postcard called Simply Thrilled, which is terrific.
There is actually also, I believe it's probably still on iPlayer somewhere, there's a very good documentary made by BBC Scotland about the Scottish indie scene, which talks very much about this.
The sound of young Scotland. Moving on to the week's featured writer, Danny Goldberg. Now, Danny started life as a writer on Billboard, Circus, and other publications, and then became a publicist, and he ended up becoming the vice president of Swan Song Records, Led Zeppelin's label. So he sort of got his foot in the door in the industry and became quite a bigwig. I mean, he ended up being the head of like Warner Brothers at one point. And I've interviewed Danny a couple of times and like him very much. He's written a number of books now, and as I said earlier, he's just published a book about his most famous client, Kurt Cobain.
The picture of the two of them on the homepage is very funny.
It's splendid.
Yeah, Danny was one half of Gold Mountain Entertainment in LA, and Nirvana became their biggest client. They also managed Bonnie Raitt and others, Nirvana they took on, and I think Danny played a pretty big part in turning this grunge band from Washington State into the biggest band in the world. Yeah. So we've chosen three pieces from 1971. There's quite a long piece about Alice Cooper. So it's pre-Schools Out.
It's pretty early. It's not the earliest. In fact, I will talk later on about possibly the earliest.
The earliest of Alice Cooper.
Yeah. But Circus in 71 was still a really good magazine. It stultified into a sort of a mag aimed at the Midwest, Quaalude swallowing, hard rock sort of market.
But it came free with Quaaludes.
It came free with Quaaludes.
Taped onto the back cover.
But in 71, only a couple of years before morphed out of Hullabaloo and was a tremendous, scrappy magazine with some very, very good writers on. I mean, it continued to have very good writers. Unfortunately, the very good writers had to write to a sort of an editorial standpoint, which was inherently limiting. And Danny was one of the very good, scrappy writers on that magazine.
Well, I mean, he's interesting on Alice Cooper, and Cooper talks in the interview about something that's very relevant right now. He talks about being male and female. And, of course, they were these shock rockers. Yep. His name was Alice Cooper. He wore a dress. They did all kinds of outrageous things on stage. But it's an interesting piece of kind of early transgression in rock. I mean, it was signed and produced by Frank Zappa. And then there's an account from Circus of the beginning of Led Zeppelin's 1975 tour. It starts very inauspiciously with Jimmy breaking his finger just before flying to Chicago. They all arrive in Chicago and they're all wearing, I mean, Robert Plant's wearing a sort of frilly shirt, completely unprepared, apparently, for Chicago weather in January.
Sounds cold.
And then just the last of Danny's pieces, a really interesting piece. I had no idea when I met Danny, whenever it was, that he'd actually been at school with the late, great Gil Scott-Heron. And I think essentially it was a school up in, like, Riverdale.
Sorry, where's Riverdale?
Riverdale, New York.
Right.
So it's sort of north of the Bronx, I think I'm right in saying. And Danny went to this school, and it was essentially, I mean, pretty much everyone there was Jewish, but there were, like, 5 scholarship places.
Right.
And Gil Scott-Heron was one of the scholarship boys. And so it's a remarkable kind of account of being at school with Gil Scott-Heron, and he talks about how they were assigned homework to write something about their childhoods, and they all did their rather predictable kind of accounts of what it was like growing up in suburban New York. And then apparently Gil took the floor and talked for sort of half an hour about growing up in Tennessee before moving to the East Coast, and Danny says it was so brilliant, you instantly knew this guy was going to be a great writer, and there's no way you were ever going to be able to compare with him. So
fascinating.
Yeah, really interesting. So that's the free stuff on RBP, and at this point, of course, we turn our attention to what ain't free.
What ain't free. Right, starting off in Discs, 1963, June Harris interviewing Gerry Marsden, the Gerry out of Gerry and the Pacemakers. And it's basically all about how he likes his women and how he gets to pull
another one of these 60s pieces about
women.
Blokes and women.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, he calls them Judies, which is a very scarce expression. I had heard the expression the first time, but it has rather sort of gone out of kind of common usage.
Sort of the scouse version of the Australian Sheila.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I know I'm not good looking. I'm not very tall, about 5'7", but I get along with the Judies just fine. I bet you do, Gerry. The one thing the success has taught, I should really be doing this in a Scouse accent, but I can't do Scouse. No, I'm not going to try.
Right. Can you do one?
The one thing that success has taught me... Well, the one thing success has taught... Oh, just dry up, you two. The one thing success has taught me is how to dress. All the sloppy clothes are out, and no girl really likes to be seen with a boy who's untidy, you know.
This is the guy who sang You'll Never Walk Alone, isn't it?
Yes, right.
The great Scouse hymn, really.
It is the great Scouse hymn. Moving on to what we've just been talking about. This is the wonderful John Mendelsohn, who we had as a guest a couple of months back on this podcast, writing for his student paper, the UCLA Daily Bruin, about a bizarre records night at the Shrine Auditorium, featuring headlining the Mothers of Invention, and support acts Alice Cooper and Wildman Fisher. Well, Wildman Fisher's a fairly interesting character. He did one album, was it, or 2 albums for Bizarre?
An Evening with Wildman Fisher.
Which was a kind of record which a lot of my friends had for some reason, but never really listened to.
Freaks had it.
Freaks had it.
Unlistenable.
Well, it's good for rolling joints on, but not much else, you know. But for me, the fascinating thing is that this is certainly, in terms of the Rock's Back Pages library, the very earliest mention of Alice Cooper.
That's pretty cool.
And John writes, Alice Cooper, a group consisting of 5 girls or 5 very long-haired guys or some combination of the two, totaling 5, followed Mr. Wildman. They are, after the Crazy World of Arthur Brown, the second most visually freaky group in captivity. It's another splendid John Mendelssohn review. I mean, I can read him all day, even though I disagree with virtually every single assertion he will make about anything. It's really good. He's very good on Wild Man Fisher, who apparently was a UCLA graduate, or at least a student at UCLA.
And genuinely barking mad. So that's a classic from 15th of January 1969. Right.
The show actually happened in December 68. One of the things he doesn't, the GTOs are on that bill, and he doesn't give them a mention. I suspect because he arrived too late to see them, or something like that. Which is a shame, because it'd been great to have a live review of the GTOs.
Who were also on a Zappa.
They were on Bizarre or Straight.
All of these people were effectively Zappa alumni.
Distributed by Warner Brothers. The two labels, of course, Zappa being Zappa. The freakier groups came out on the Straight label, and the slightly less freaky groups came out on the Bizarre label.
Alice Cooper made no real ripples at that time, and I had to transfer first of all to Detroit and then to New York to make it again a couple of years later. I mean, we talked about 1971, the piece you were just talking about, and that's exactly that. Moving on to 73, a very interesting Lorraine Altman interview with Yoko Ono. We forget that Yoko was still hated by millions of people as a woman who broke up the Beatles and all sorts of stuff. She had released maybe 2, maybe 3 solo albums at this point. And she says, John was a male chauvinist when I met him, and I think he was rather surprised. I'm sure there was a period when John might have felt threatened by what I do, but I don't think he feels it now. This is pretty interesting. This is a genuine relationship, which, despite its rocky moments, was incredibly important to both of them. She talks a lot about sort of feminism and sort of how that is defined. She says, I don't think it's the answer to our problems to become the master race and turn men into slavery. That's a drag. But she does...
Drag.
That's a drag.
That's a drag, man.
And she says also, going back to what I was saying earlier, she says, I think there's a definite, almost determined hatred towards me in the business. There's all these sorts of snide remarks.
But I think that's still the case, in a way. I mean,
she's kind of, I think, becoming the widow.
Yeah.
Actually elevated her away from that.
Sure.
Curiously.
Yeah. But people still don't like... People still kind of...
Don't like what she does.
Don't like what she does, but there's a sort of sneering thing about it. Oh, she's kind of just a bit nuts or whatever. I don't know.
I think that was certainly the case in the past. I think that the moment she became the widow, that actually a lot of people who disliked her started treating her with a curious kind of almost too much reverence in some ways. Almost went too far.
But again, isn't that again just a case of not treating her for herself, but treating her for her relationship with
that's a very good point indeed. I actually kind of her artwork. She was part of the Fluxus group, who are a very, very interesting group. I think she was a serious artist, though she made some excruciatingly awful films. Let's not kind of. But her records, the stuff I like was the very early stuff when she's absolutely wild, caterwauling woman. And the more she straightened out as a musician, the less interesting she was to me.
I'll always forgive her everything for Walking on Thin Ice, that extraordinary record that came out after Lennon's death.
Right.
And also, I think there's really good stuff on Approximately Infinite Universe. Is an amazing record.
I think so.
As footnotes, it's worth mentioning here that 2 of our writers played quite big parts in the John and Yoko story. So Miles, Barry Miles, it was at his Indica bookshop in London that they first met when she was exhibiting in London. And this is written by Lorraine Altman, of course, who is really one of our most important writers, I would say. She was writing for the Detroit Free Press in the mid-60s.
As a sort of teen writer, but with a real slant on rock and roll music.
And she got quite close to some of these people, including John and Yoko. Yeah. And just little-known fact today, that she married the great actor Peter Boyle.
Yes.
And John and Yoko were there, and John Lennon was Peter's best man at their wedding. Huh. And
that's great.
I actually met her at this huge apartment she's got on the Upper East Side, overlooking the East River. And John and Yoko had been in that apartment. Peter Boyle, I think, had died in that apartment. And it was, so you got a sense that this woman was really very well connected.
I have a huge amount of time for her. I mean, as I said, she starts off as a very young teen writer for the Detroit Free Press. I mean,
really
she herself is like 17 or 18. She's writing this column. And it is a fanish type comment. But even then, she's getting some interesting barbs about stuff or anything. She's one of the very few women who wrote about pop who then translated into being a woman who wrote seriously about rock, inverted commas.
Right. Yes.
Penny Valentine did that in this country. Lorraine Altman did that in America. Not many others managed to do that. For men, it was a thing you could... Well, it's possible.
Sure.
It was very, very hard for women to make that transition.
I think she was, when Rolling Stone set up their first office in New York, before they moved to New York, I think I'm right in saying that Jan Wenner put her in charge of that.
That's correct.
With Chris Hodenfield, I think. Yeah. So that was the New York office.
Moving on to 79. Joy Division.
In case you hadn't got enough last week.
Last week. Well, in fact, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is a weird echo of last week. But talking about this, Dave McCulloch, who, if anyone out there knows of Dave McCulloch or his family's whereabouts, get in touch with us.
He appears to have disappeared without trace.
We can't reach him. We're running his stuff with, sort of, strictly speaking, without permission. We'd like to do it properly. So if anyone knows his whereabouts or any relatives of his whereabouts, that'd be brilliant. He goes to Strawberry Studios in Stockport to meet the band. He himself is something of a fan. The photographer Slattery isn't. And it starts off okay. The band are a bit wary of these journalist presence. And in those days, bands were sort of meant to suspect journalists. I'm sure Barney, you as an interviewer got that from some
I've never
bands.
been suspected.
Never been suspected of being a journalist. Ian Curtis says, "Yeah, I'm a total pessimist, I suppose. I mean, our first single got bad. I mean, unfavourable. But I thought very well written reviews," which is
funny.
Anyway, the whole interview basically starts going tits up in a hurry. McCulloch writes, "Soon it is the bearded bassist who takes control of all the verbal rallies, with a bludgeoning, clumsy style, revealing raging neurotic symptoms as he tells me everything in inverse, ironic confessions. So you're saying the lyrics are pessimistic then, are you?" He bawls as Slattery and myself, knowing I hadn't so much as mentioned the word pessimistic throughout the conversation, can't help but start laughing. "Oh, fuck off," the bearded one tells me. I switch the tape off and get up to leave. "Sorry, do you want a drink?" It goes downhill from there. Then they stay and see the band playing live that night. And McCulloch, who had previously been a real fan of the band, by the end of the evening, really doesn't like them at all.
It's a good piece, though. I like his writing.
It's pretty. He's not a good stylist as a writer, but he's quite good at vividly reporting what
exactly. It kind of puts you in the situation.
Yeah,
he tends to get slightly overlooked in the story of kind of music journalism in that era, doesn't he? I mean, and most people, you think of Joy Division at that period, and it's always John Savage or Paul Morley writing about them, sometimes Chris Bonn. But McCulloch actually does get to interview them. They didn't do many interviews.
That's right.
There aren't many instances of Ian Curtis actually speaking.
That's right. And the other guy, of course, is Mick Middles.
Mick Middles, of course.
Who was, Mr. Manchester. So anyway, it's a great piece, and it's really good reading it in the light of the reverence with which Joy Division, as we talked about last week, held. Talking about last week is our guest from last week, John Savage. The next piece is from 89, The Observer, March 89, Depeche Mode. Depeche Mode were in the process of just finishing this movie by
Don Pennebaker
called 101. The concert, which had been filmed in question, was filmed at the Pasadena Rose Bowl the previous year in 1988. I was actually in Los Angeles when that concert took place. And
it's a huge place.
I was staggered by how hugely popular Depeche Mode. Around the same time, The Cure again played a stadium in Los Angeles. The Cure, for God's sake. And this is quite interesting. What they say is here is the group feels mildly miffed that it is underappreciated in Britain. Here, a critical insistence on authenticity, inverted commas, expressed in the vogue for roots or new country music, has kept the spotlight away from synthetic pop. In the US, there's no such problem. They've been fed authentic music for so long in the States, says Fletcher. What they want is something different. There, Depeche Mode have found a ready audience across the board and has had a considerable influence on black dance styles such as house and garage. Remember, this is 89. This is basically a year before grunge, and grunge was completely changed the game. In 89, for a lot of young American kids, it was bands like the Depeche Mode and The Cure who were doing something different from what everything else was happening on the radio, For me, Depeche Mode were a band I kind of quite liked. I liked their very early singles. They were real pioneers of electropop, and we forget that. They went through the thing of losing basically their leader, the songwriter Vince Clarke left fairly early, and yet they managed to kind of rally their forces and keep going. But for me, they were always kind of a singles band. They were someone who'd turn up on top of the pops. I don't think I ever listened to a complete Depeche Mode album.
I don't know that I've ever listened to a Depeche Mode album, if I'm honest.
But in America, they had this huge sort of impact, and they became sort of real Los Angeles people themselves, and one or two of them really got heavily into drugs in LA and the rock and roll sort of life.
I mean, I saw Depeche Mode at the Venue in London 1981. I mean, literally, it must have been their sort of second or third London gig.
Yeah.
And I really liked them in that early iteration. New Life and Just Can't Get Enough. Those early singles I loved.
Just Can't Get Enough.
Classic electro-pop singles.
Fantastic record.
And you sort of thought they'd probably come and go.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone
anticipated
predicted that they would become this sort of band that took themselves quite seriously, this sort of very kind of somber kind of gothic electro-pop with rock star moves and heroin habits.
It was quite a story. They talk in this interview, really interesting, exactly what we were talking about earlier, which is about the early pioneering indie and DIY scene, because the very great Daniel Miller, who, in order to release his own record, was it the Normal, Warm Leatherette, or something, maybe it was one before that, started Mute Records. He signed them to Mute. They could have left Mute at any time and gone for much more money to a much bigger label, but they stayed with Mute, I think, for their entire career.
I think so, yeah.
And they talk in the interview about how Daniel is always involved in all the discussions they have about just about everything, that their relationship with their record label boss is incredibly close and positive.
Very smart guy, Daniel Miller, I think, because without chasing money and power, he's kept Mute as an ongoing and very, very viable business. I mean, no doubt Depeche Mode
bankrolled
been the biggest cash cow and bankrolled all sorts of other much less commercial music, but Nick Cave as well.
But we've also got to remember that Erasure were on Mute, the Yazoo were on Mute. They were Vince Clarke's bands after Depeche Mode. Daniel Miller commanded a loyalty from his artists, which I think is surprising in any sort of area of the business, because it's quite unusual. And I think it's partly because he was extremely honest with them. That when money came in, he paid them. There was none of this sort of ducking and diving, which so many even groovy label heads do. Yeah.
And I think he also kept quite a narrow aesthetic.
Yes.
He didn't try to sign, completely inappropriate pop acts. Everyone who's ever been on Mute kind of belongs there.
Yes. I think
it's a kind of family in a way.
Yeah.
And even if Nick Cave wouldn't think he had anything in common with Erasure, which he wouldn't. Nonetheless, I think they never sort of got too big for their boots, and as a result, Mute is still there, still in the game, still an important label.
I think it's his aesthetic. Yes. I think Daniel Miller, he will put out a record if he likes it. Yes. That's the only reason he'll put out a record.
Yes.
Well, I think absolutely. I think you can say similar things about Atlantic in the 60s with people like Gerry Wexler and Ahmet Ertegun, is that they didn't just shove any old thing out. It had to be something they liked. And I think that's what makes labels succeed. I think it's made what Creation did succeed until the lifestyles of the various participants sort of basically spiraled out of control. Yeah. And I think it's the story of all the best indie labels. It's got to be one man's real vision
or one woman's.
Or one woman's vision, indeed. Last thing is just a quote. Dave Grohl, Foo Fighters, talking to Stuart Bailey and Vox in 97. There's all this stuff about how Dave Grohl believes in this, collects that, and so on. He says, I love science fiction movies, but I don't pray to the alien god in my fucking pyramid temple. And I just like that. So that's pretty much that.
Well, thanks, Mark.
What have you got?
Well, I think Jasper and I have got a few little things just to touch on from the last, 20 plus years. I wanted to just mention en passant that I saw that you had added a piece on Lenny Waronker by Joel Selman. And that was nice to see. And it's particularly about these three albums that Lenny essentially produced at the beginning of his Warner Brothers / Reprise career. Yep. So it was the first Randy Neiman album, it was the first Ry Cooder album, and it was this Everly Brothers album called Roots, which is really hugely important record in terms of, kind of Americana, country rock, alternative country. Anyway, it's a great little piece acknowledging what an incredibly tasteful, smart guy Waronker is.
I found it sad in that the year before he had been basically pushed out of Warner's along with Mo Austin, who had been his old boss.
They were all given the heave ho.
And that was, I think, really the time when the music industry turned sour for a lot of us in terms of, what it meant. That it was all about the bottom line, nothing to do with, in fact, what I've just been talking about in terms of the independent labels, about identity and so on and so forth. Lenny Waronker was a proper good record man.
He really was. I mean, that sound, that kind of Burbank sound, I think, is still one of my favourite sounds. They, of course, went to DreamWorks. David Geffen brought Mo Austin and Lenny and I think some other Warner's people to DreamWorks, and the idea was that we're going to somehow kind of replicate the aesthetic and sense, but it didn't quite happen. It could have been great. I mean, DreamWorks still exists as a movie studio and so forth. The other, there's a great piece by the wonderful Jan Jehelski on the Stooges from 2007. I love the way Jan just writes sort of unapologetically about Iggy's member. And she's known Iggy for kind of, donkey's years. They knew each other in Detroit at the beginning of the Stooges story. So that's a terrific piece.
She's great.
She is wonderful. Yeah. We love Jan. And there's a piece from 2013, Paul Morley, bemoaning the fact that the Rolling Stones are headlining Glastonbury. And finally, from my side, a piece by Simon Reynolds about Burial's album Untrue, which is one of my absolute favourite records. A fascinating piece.
Yeah.
Are you a fan of Burial?
Yeah, I'm a fan of Burial.
To me, he is like one of the only guys that's come out of London in the last 15 years who I would say is a genius. Just the 2 albums he's made and a bunch of EPs. And Simon is saying this is why it's the most important electronic music album of the 21st century.
His stuff has been, I think, if you think about any electronic music producer of the last kind of 15 years who's made something that you like, it's probably been influenced. They probably like Burial, even if you don't know it, kind of thing.
Well, that's good to hear.
Everyone who I speak to who's involved in electronic music thinks Burial's great. So
I'm really pleased to hear that, because he's such an enigmatic and indeed sort of almost invisible figure, isn't it? No one really knows who he is. I think those records are, they're both kind of they're spooky, but they're incredibly moving as well.
Yeah.
I mean, they are the
Great
sound of sort of disenfranchised urban youth in this century, aren't they? And anyway, so over to you for some other pieces.
A few pieces. First of which is a Mel C album review that I initially thought, Mel C of the Spice Girls, of course, Sporty Spice.
Right.
I thought it was a feature about her not wanting to rejoin the Spice Girls reunion, which was at the time on the cards. This is 2003, Lisa Verrico writing in The Times. It turns out it's an album review of her second solo album, Reason, and then there are 2 more album reviews. It's sort of long set of album reviews. An album review of Moloko's Statues and Clipse's Lord Willin', more on that in a sec. Mm-hmm. But she's funny about Mel C's Reason. There is a hitch, however. Reason just isn't a cool album. It's partly that Mel's voice is so soulless that she's trying so hard to please everyone. She's quite complimentary about Mel C and her decision not to want to be part of the Spice Girls again, but she can't really do much about the fact that she doesn't like the record.
Mel C was always meant to be the best singer of all of...
That was the idea.
That was the idea. But, as you say, exposed by itself... I mean, I was pretty fond of the Spice Girls. I thought they had a mad, sort of batty charm at the time, sort of, antidote to all kinds of ghastly muck that was happening. Though I found them wrapping themselves in the Union Jack something I don't like anyone, whether it's Morrissey or Ginger Spice.
I don't think I'd ever even heard of, let alone heard, this second album. I know that Northern Star was a pretty big record for Melanie C, wasn't it?
Lisa talks about that as well. Says it's also rubbish, but...
Rubbish, but successful rubbish.
Yes.
I think Reason probably just did not sell anywhere near as...
Possibly not.
As many copies.
But the other thing that I want to point out in this article was actually our first piece about Clipse, who are a rap duo consisting of Malice and Pusha T, and it's produced by the Neptunes.
Right.
It's a pretty great record, actually. I listened to it again yesterday. Lord Willin'. Lisa Verrico says that it's if you don't mind the Neanderthal attitude to women that they have, Lord Willin is a classic, which is pretty much accurate. It is a rap album from the early 2000s, and it sounds like that, and they're not particularly. But what's funny is that Malice, right around the time when Clipse was supposed to be getting back together for a 10th anniversary tour of this album, Malice became a born-again Christian and changed his name to No Malice. Which I think is hilarious. But he's had pretty big beef with Pusha T. It's very funny.
But is it a Christian beef? Just a beef. I mean, can you really have a beef as a born-again Christian?
Oh, yeah.
Surely you should be getting over your beef.
No, I'd say...
No?
Well, I mean, evidence points to the exact opposite.
You can have a beef with the devil, obviously. But I mean, can you have a beef with a former member
Well,
of Clipse?
because the former member is the devil, and he's got the devil in him,
See where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Next up, Twist and Pout, Cheryl Cole's new album cover. This is a piece by Laura Barton in The Guardian in 2009. This is a really intelligent piece, actually, sort of like pseudo-art historical kind of examination of... I'm going to get some flack for that, but pseudo-historical kind of examination of the looking over the shoulder pose, and she goes through and lists a bunch of, because this is an album cover where Cheryl Cole is looking, photographed in black and white by Knight.
It is Nick Knight.
Knight,
the famous Vogue photographer.
And
I got photographed by him once.
Well done, you.
With your shoulder exposed?
No,
racily with your bare shoulder. Laura Barton lists a bunch of examples of previous album covers that feature this, and then manages to bring it round to the portrait of the Queen that features on this nation's stamps.
All started with Her Majesty,
which is also an over-the-shoulder pose, although it's less come hither and
is
slightly.
It?
Well, it's sort of, yeah. It's a sort
the
of
Queen,
it's a three-quarter portrait.
I thought it was a straight profile. Mind you, I haven't looked at a stamp for about 1 million years.
Well, you can take it up with Laura Barton.
I haven't sent a letter for about.
But it's an interesting piece, and it's very well put together, and it's a nice little examination of the kind that you don't get that often.
She's a really good writer, is Laura. I think she's terrific. Well, actually, one of the things I really like about her is I'm certainly in her Hail Rock and Roll column in The Guardian, is she writes about the experience of listening to music, not the music itself or the musicians, certainly not about the musicians, but about the experience of listening to music, which is a really good way of talking about music.
Definitely.
Not enough people do, I think. Anyway, she's a good one.
And then finally, a live review of Lauryn Hill, playing in 2014, so this is quite a long time after she did anything really noteworthy. Ian Gittins goes to see her and isn't actually overall that impressed. She apparently had a sizable live band and was reimagining a bunch of classic tunes, Fugees and all her solo stuff, and he just didn't think that they pulled it off that well. He says, having growled "I only have eyes for you" at a volume that would elicit admiring nods from Shirley Bassey, Hill plays the doe-eyed ingenue on Cher's "Bang Bang My Baby Shot Me Down," subverting its cooing submissiveness by whipping off her cap to reveal a shaven head, then closes by strafing her melodious biggest hit "Doo-Wop That Thing" with eardrum shredding bass. The big attitude that Lauryn Hill exhibits all night can't obliterate the impression that she remains an object lesson in wasted potential.
Right. I mean, it is really... She is really interesting. I mean, she was a massive star in a hurry. First with the Fugees, then with her first solo album, which I still think is a pretty wonderful record.
Miseducation is a brilliant record.
And then, for whatever reason, she lost all kinds of plots. She wouldn't turn up at shows. She basically sort of dropped out for a great chunk of time. I was meant to be seeing her at a free concert in Grant Park in Chicago in 2005, and she just never turned up, and they had to draft an LL Cool J at the last minute to sort of fill the top spot.
I mean, she became a bit of a car crash, didn't she? Really? I mean, I think she had some mental health issues, and I've not read a kind of good word about her for a long time now. I mean,
it's such a shame.
Saw her at Madison Square Gardens, probably late 90s, when Miseducation had just come out. And it was just a fabulous show. And I love the Fugees. And I do think it's really sad that she hasn't kind of, she just hasn't been wasted potential. She should be one of the biggest stars on earth.
My question has always been, is this a classic case of strong weed psychosis, actually? Because I think she was partial to all of that. And,
hanging out with Marleys will do that for you.
Well, it's just possible that she may have been fragile mentally in the first place and may have been tipped over the edge.
She didn't seem nuts when she was in the Fugees.
No, but you know, American weed is so strong these days. You know, it's really something else. And that I just wondered whether
it has occurred to me and probably others.
Very sad, very sad.
She's playing here this summer.
She is, yeah.
Well, assuming she turns up.
Ms. Lauryn Hill, as she's now billed.
Right.
Yeah,
Lauren,
well, I mean,
she's not just Lauryn Hill.
Right, okay.
Hopefully she does manage to make some... I mean, I think she has been doing more live gigs in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And, you know, hopefully that's a sign that she will go on to do some more stuff. Because, I mean, the miseducation of Lauryn Hill is...
It's a long time ago now.
It's a long time ago, but it was
20,
bloody great.
20 plus years?
20 plus years.
Okay, well, that's very sad.
Sorry.
Can we quickly talk about something light and frivolous?
Fluffy. Let's find something fluffy to talk about.
Next week we'll try and reinstate some of the fluffiness.
Yeah.
There's a pretty good chance that next week's podcast will be Mark and Jasper, Sans Moi. You guys may well be talking about the Reverend Al Green next week.
Will we?
So I'm sorry to miss that, being a massive Al Green fan, but I know you both are too. He's about to start his first tour in a long while. And,
I saw him a few years back at Albert Hall, and he was
Save it for next week. We can just record it now.
Just roll.
Can't I just spunk it now?
Tune in, on that note, tune in next week for conversation about the Reverend Al Green and other new things on Rock's Back Pages. We will see you soon.
And we're going to play out with a clip from Todd Rundgren where he talks about originality and plagiarism.
Thanks for listening.
Take it away, Todd.
Bye!
I realized at some point how easy it was to plagiarize and how often one plagiarizes. It's very hard to claim to be original. Musicians are so heavily influenced by other musicians, who in turn were influenced by other musicians, that it's got to be one of the most miscegenated art forms in existence. And it's because we work from such a narrow palette. Tonally, there's only certain things that a contemporary audience is willing to listen to, and only certain kinds of subject matter tend to be the topic of just about every popular song that gets written. So originality is extremely difficult if it's possible at all. And I had that realization when probably when MC Hammer had his big hit "Can't Touch This."
Yeah.
Which he took somebody else's song and just like modified it slightly and had a bigger hit than the original.
That was Todd Rundgren in conversation with Bill DeMain in 1997, concluding this week's Rock's Back Pages podcast. The hosts were Barney Hoskins and Mark Pringle, and it was co-hosted and produced by Jasper Bowie. For a list of articles discussed and full show notes, please visit rocksbackpages.com/podcast. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews at rocksbackpages.com.